So, hi, I'm Tor. I'm Assistant Trees and Woodlands Advisor for the National Trust covering the southwest of England. And prior to my current role, I was ranger at Leewoods for almost 20 years. And as part of my role, I had the privilege of looking after their cohort of veteran trees. And they have there's around 500 veteran trees at Leewoods. Most of those are lapsed oak pollards, and we will look at that a bit more as we go through the presentation. During this talk, we're going to be looking at how we define veteran trees, their importance for wildlife, their historical and cultural importance, why it is important for us to look after them, and a brief look at how we look after them. It's quite a big subject, and this is quite a short talk, so it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll be pointing you towards where you can get more information at the end. So to start with, how do we define ancient and veteran trees? So ancient trees are trees which are old for their species, and this is dependent upon the species. So for an oak tree, this is upwards of 500 years. They can live to over 1,000 years. And for a silver birch, that would be 100 to 150 years. So ancient trees are obviously old. They are usually very wide, have very wide trunks. Their trunks are extensively hollow and they have a squat form and a reduced crown. A veteran tree is a tree which has survived the rigors of life and shows features of ancientness at a younger age. And we're going to look in a minute at some of those features of ancientness. So all ancient trees are veteran, but not all veteran trees are ancient. So here we have some of the features of ancientness. So there will be deadwood, usually in many forms and in many parts of the tree. So we may have deadwood in the crown. So there could be hanging deadwood. There'll be fallen deadwood on the ground. We will see sap runs, bark loss, and major trunk cavities. So this is part of the aging process that we are going to be looking at in a minute. There'll be fungal fruiting bodies. You may not see these at all times of the year, depends on the fungi associated with the tree. There can be water-filled holes, lots of decay holes of varying shapes and sizes in different parts of the tree, and snags and stubs and cracks and splits. So how trees age. So the young tree is apically dominant. Growth is upwards. It has a leader, or it might have a double leader. So I've got a bit of a cold. And the branches are pointing upwards. It'll have a thin stem and it'll have a taproot. This taproot anchors it into the ground. As the tree goes through its life, it enters the mature stage here, and branches become more horizontal. The tree starts to bulk up and they start to lose this taproot, and they start to develop roots which spread out wider. It's around the same time that they lose their taproot, then they start to hollow. So as a mature tree, it has a large primary crown. We then move into the ancient phase of the tree, where the tree starts to lose this primary crown, it starts to lose this apical dominance, and it starts to form a secondary crown lower down. And during this whole process, it carries on to bulking up and putting on wood and getting wider. It also continues to hollow out. So this tree, the tree can go through this process of forming a secondary crown a couple of times, and this is called retrenchment, and people refer to it as growing down. So here we have the primary crown and then the secondary crown forming, and as it goes through its life, it can then go into a tertiary or remnant crown. So the important point to make is that trees have an indefinite growth pattern. So they do not have a finite lifespan. They have the capacity to add new twigs, roots, layers of wood and bark throughout their lifetimes. Theoretically, they can live forever. So we're just going to look at that again in a more illustrated form. This gives you more of an idea of what the tree looks like as it's going through this phase. So this is the primary crown, and here we've got a secondary crown, and then here we have a tertiary crown. And as it's going through this process, it's laying down wood, but it's also putting on this reaction wood to kind of shore up parts of itself where there are stresses. It's kind of adaptive or reactive wood. When I was at school a long time ago, I was told that an oak tree spends 300 years growing, 300 years sitting as a mature tree, and 300 years dying. And that's not exactly correct. So the young stage of a tree's life is the shortest stage, and then we move into this mature stage, and then the ancient stage is the longest stage of this tree's life. So just look at that retrenched crown again, and this is a photograph illustrating this. It's a tree which is in Cornwall, and here we can see this strong secondary crown, and we can see that the primary crown is starting to die back. And now this is really strong, it can then lose this crown. And oak trees often form, you can just about see it starting there, they often form a stag-headed appearance as they go through this process. So as I said, this tree is in Cornwall, but there's another tree in Ashton Court which demonstrates this perfectly. This is something that I love to see, and I call it retrenchment in action. So here is a girth chart, and this gives us an idea. It's a useful guide in looking at the correlation between the size and the species. So for a yew tree, it's useful for looking at when we think a tree might be reaching its ancient phase. So for a yew tree, you're talking it needs to have a girth of around 5 meters, but for a hawthorn, then that can be 1.5 meters. So as we discussed a little in the start, that veteran tree is more independent of size. So a veteran tree is more about the features of ancientness it has rather than the size of its trunk. So it's not necessarily a wide girth tree. Why are these trees important? Well, they're beautiful. They inspire feelings of awe. They've lived through many human lifetimes and they're still alive. They've inspired many books, poems, drawings, and paintings. I often think of them stood in one place, slowly getting bigger as the world changes around them. So the Pueblo oak, which is looked after by Avon Needs Trees, is estimated to be around 1,000 years old. And just think about how the world has changed while it's just stood there silently growing. Another important thing about these trees, and for me, one of the most important things, is that they are uncommon. And that's easy for us to get sitting in the UK, because the UK has more ancient veteran trees than any other country in Europe, and some say the world. It's even easier for me to forget this because I work on National Trust properties, and the National Trust is the biggest custodian of veteran trees in this country. So they are where I work, but they are uncommon, and we need to remember that. So we are losing about 1% of this population a year, and we'll look at why that might be happening in a minute. We're also going to look at more detail about the biodiversity associated with them and their historical and cultural importance. So why are we losing 1% a year? So there's a cultural lack of awareness of how trees age and the value of decay habitats. There's a widespread misconception that trees have a more or less fixed lifespan like humans, and this is often quoted as a supposed reason for getting rid of them and planting a replacement tree. So as we discussed a minute ago, trees don't have a finite lifespan. So it could be also to do with lack of resource, knowledge, and expertise. These trees can be more expensive to look after as they get older, but not always. Often small, low-cost interventions in the land around them will make a big difference to their lifespan and their vitality. Development, of course, creates conflict and can result in sudden changes for them. They don't cope well with sudden change, and particularly in their rooting area. Also, pressures from development can lead to the desire to fell them. These trees may also be inappropriately managed. We're going to look more about management in a minute. So protection for these trees is getting better, but there's still much work to be done. So they are now considered irreplaceable habitat under biodiversity net gain, but we still need to do more work. And the Woodland Trust is currently running a campaign calling for better protection for these trees. It was good to hear Susan talk about planting the future generation, because that's another problem these trees have. There aren't many successors coming up behind them. So if now we look at biodiversity, so biodiversity is the number of different living things in one place. A single mature oak tree can support 1,000 plus species at one time. And this is a nice quote from Oliver Rackham, the famous landscape historian and conservation author. And he says 10,000 oaks of 100 years old are not a substitute for one 500-year-old oak. Now, a 100-year-old oak can be thought of as a mature oak. So if we look at that again, a mature oak tree supports 1,000 plus species, yet 10,000 of those trees are not a substitute for one 500-year-old oak. And that can start to give you an idea of the numbers of species that are associated with a single tree. So they are habitats for bats, birds, lichen, fungi, beetles, spiders, dormice, moths, and other plants. They are considered to be keystone structures due to the amount and variety of life they support. So a wide range of taxonomic groups are represented, covering a wide range of lifestyles. So this includes predators, decomposers, and parasites. They're all part of the food chain. Some recycle nutrients, some are important pollinators. Many, but not all of these, have an annual life cycle, which makes them very vulnerable to sudden change. And they might require different habitats at different stages in their life. So the larvae may live inside the tree, living on the decaying wood, while the adult may need nectar from a flower before it can breed. And this is just a small example of the species that we might find associated with them. So they're living box of flats. Some of these species are specialist, some are more generalist. Here we have the violet click beetle, which is a very rare deadwood specialist. It's only found in 3 places in the UK now. This beetle is entirely reliant on the decaying wood of ash and beech trees. And here we have a Beckstein's bat. A staggering 75% of the UK's bat species rely on trees throughout their stages of their lifetime. So they use them for hunting, mating, living in woodlands. They rely on trees for roosting sites. The loss of this habitat means this once common species is now one of our rarer bats. And here we've got a tawny owl. They make nests in the tree cavities to avoid predators. So let's look again at that diagram we looked at a minute ago. So now we can see that those features of ancientness that we looked at earlier are habitat niches. These are habitat features. So if we look at them again with some of the species that might be associated with them, we've got sunbaked aerial deadwood, which may be supporting longhorn beetles, among many others. The weak fork is an ideal place for birds' nests, for squirrels and micromoths. Flux on the bark establishes a sap run for wildlife, and the beetles and fungus gnats can use these. Suspended limbs provide a large surface area for fungi and egg laying. Heart rot and fungal colonization of roots prepares the wood for invertebrates. And this slow drying fallen timber in partial shade just represents another one of those habitat niches. So as we talked about earlier, this tree is hollowing, and this cavity can support many species, including crane flies, lesser stag beetles. The water rot holes might be home to hoverflies and water beetles, and the fungal growth on the bark may be supporting false ladybirds and many other species of beetle. So the importance of deadwood. 11% of all UK fauna have life cycles which are dependent upon deadwood habitat. This includes 1,700 invertebrate species, including the rarest 7% most threatened invertebrates. So dead and decaying wood is an important component of woodland, wood pasture and parkland. It's also very important in urban environments. And it's important for us to retain as much of this as we can. Decaying wood is used by a wide range of saprophilic, so that just means deadwood organisms. And wood decay is a natural process which releases nutrients, making them available to higher plants, including the tree itself. So different stages of decay attract different species. As decay develops, different species are able to use it, leading to a succession of colonization and emigration. All types of deadwood are valuable. So that's standing, fallen, hanging. Bigger is better, both in terms of diameter and length. The larger the piece of wood, the more valuable it is. It's important to retain wood which is 20 centimetres or greater in diameter. Large pieces of wood dry out and decay slower, providing this habitat for longer, allowing the succession of species. Species can remain in larval form for many years, so require the continuation of that habitat. So dead wood showing any sign of decay should always be left and as intact as possible. Many of these species have a range of hundreds of meters rather than hundreds of meters. Once the wood has been colonized, we should leave it where it is. The species have moved into it because it's providing the conditions they require. If we remove it, we may be changing those conditions. It's also good to leave root plates of fallen trees where they've fallen. So the decay process and fungi. We can't talk about decay without talking about fungi. So decay releases nutrients for recycling. This is carried out by, as we've said, the wood decay communities, which includes the fungi and the deadwood invertebrates. Wood is an energy source for organisms which are able to break it down and use it. The decay process transforms wood into something that other organisms can use. Different types of decay are used by different organisms. I'm not going to go into different kinds of decay in this talk, but I'm going to point you towards a website where you can get more information on this at the end of the talk. So these two species of fungi shown here are two of the crucial heart rot decay fungi, particularly in oak. So the top one being beefsteak and the one underneath being chicken of the woods. So these are very important in this hollowing process. They break down the wood inside the tree and allow it to be recycled. So the picture on the right, these are aerial roots, which the tree puts inside itself. So as the tree has grown wider and shorter, it now doesn't need all this strength to hold up that large primary crown. So it can hollow out, and a cone being a very strong structure, but as part of that process, it puts these roots out inside itself so it can reuse the nutrients that are stored up within it. And the first time I heard that, I was blown away. I thought that was amazing. As well as taken up through the aerial roots, as the wood decays and then falls to the ground, it's taken up by the roots in the ground. These aerial roots can later form structural parts of the tree. And I know of a sweet chestnut, which is on the drive at Stour Head, where these aerial roots have actually become a tree in their own right. And you can see this younger tree bursting out of the belly of the older tree. So yeah, if you're ever at Stour Head in Wiltshire, go and have a look at that on the drive. So biology is not the only value of veteran trees. They are important historically and culturally. There's another quote by Oliver Rackham here. So this is, ancient trees are not only objects of beauty, wonder and delight, they are historical monuments and witnesses to past activities of plants, animals and people. They connect us with our past and past land uses. They help us to read the landscape. So in this photograph, we can see small leaf lime pollards on a wood bank. So when we step into this wood, this is indicating to us that this was an ancient woodland. And this photograph was taken in Kingswood on the Mendip Hills. So looking at past land uses and practices, this picture at the top shows a pollard. This is where we cut trees above head height and they regrow. And this is cyclical. So we do this in a cycle, and the length of the cycle depends upon the product that people wanted. So there, and some of the examples of product were fodder for cattle, so tree hay, fencing, building materials, firewood. This is not a practice we really widely carry out today, and we mainly carry out pollarding to look after these trees. So once a pollard is in cycle, like these ones, they should be kept in cycle. So we need to keep cutting these trees because, as we looked earlier, they've got this hollowing, decaying stem. And if we allow these stems to get bigger, then this is, could cause structural problems for this tree. So other uses, other past practices are coppicing. Coppicing was when we cut trees at the ground and then they resprout, and again we can use those materials. So fencing or firewood. We do carry out coppicing today, but mainly for conservation, woodland management. Shredding was another practice where we stripped the branches off trees, and that was for tree hay. That is a practice that we don't carry out anymore in the UK. I think it's still carried out in some countries in Europe. So this second picture, this is a historic avenue. So this is an avenue of old beech trees along a country road. And this is showing us that this was a designed landscape and probably part of an old estate. It could have been the entrance and or exit drive to a estate. These two large open grown trees at the bottom, now in woodland, are showing us that this land was probably wood pasture. So these are large open grown oaks, which are now sat in this pine plantation. And this wood pasture would have been grazed and people would have had rights to wood. So these trees could have been pollarded, but it's quite difficult to tell once they've reconfigured their crowns like that. So as well as past practices and land uses, they can connect us with specific events. So the tree at the top, this is Woolthorpe Manor, and this is the home of Isaac Newton, and this is Newton's apple tree. This one is the Ankerwick Yew in Runnymede in Kent, and it's associated with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. It's thought to be around 2,500 years old. The tree on the right is the Tolpuddle Martyrs tree in Tolpuddle in Dorset, and it's around 300 years old, and it's associated with the birth of the trade unionist movement. So how can we look after them? Trees need space and light. They are competitively weaker. This tree is a lapsed oak pollard in Lee Woods. So the southern section of Lee Woods was historic wood pasture, and this would have been grazed, and this tree would have been pollarded. Grazing stopped around 100 years ago, but we did reintroduce grazing in 2009. So this lapsed oak pollard is now sitting in secondary woodland. So it's surrounded by these younger trees. And these are the younger trees are more vigorous, so they can easily outcompete the older tree. They're going to compete for light above ground and water and nutrients underground. So what we were doing in Lee Woods is a practice called halo releasing. So we remove these trees from around this big old tree, but we need to do it slowly in stages. So shade can kill these old trees, but so can opening them up to too much light too quickly. So we used to take the trees that are next to the old tree and those that are growing through the canopy first, and then we'd leave the tree for 2 to 3 years for it to get used to its new surroundings, and then we repeat the process again, widening the circle. So we used to aim for trees to be released, they're no longer in competition with younger trees. And we used to do this in about 9 to 10 years and over 3 stages, so 3 phases. The other important thing with these old trees is for us to look after their roots. So compaction and soil around their roots is a problem for any tree, not just older trees. And that means pushing out it's closing the pore spaces in the soil, and the pore spaces are where the roots can have access to water and oxygen. And we can compact soil around a tree's roots by have lots of people walking across the roots, vehicles, stock. And it's important for us to set up a root protection area, and we're going to look at that more in a minute. So another way to look after these trees is really we only cut these trees if they pose an unacceptable risk to people or if they are at risk of structural collapse, which means that we could lose this tree. And if we do need work to be done on these trees, then it should be carried out by an arborist who's experienced in the management of veteran trees. And there's a new qualification called Vet Cert, so preferably by someone who has the Vet Cert qualification. These trees need successors, but not planted too close. So the successors need to be 35 to 40 meters away from the veteran tree. Otherwise, we end up back in this situation where we need to halo release them. So old trees are vulnerable to change. Trees go for hundreds of years, slowly optimizing themselves to their surroundings, and we can radically change their whole environment in one day. So I talked briefly about a root protection area a minute ago. So now under the National Planning Policy Framework, veteran trees require a root protection area of 15 times the stem diameter or 5 meters beyond the canopy, whichever is the greater. And we can do this in many ways. So in this photograph, we've got a small post and rail fence, and this is because this area is grazed and it's to keep the stock out from under the tree, because the animals like to come and shelter under this tree. So you'll get compaction of the soil, you might get root damage, and also nutrient enrichment, which the trees don't really like. So when I was at school, I was also taught that the above ground, what's below the ground is a reflection of what's above the ground. And actually, it's more like a wine glass. So the roots are wide, they extend out a long way from the trunk, and they're quite shallow. Things that can affect the roots are changes to ground level, so loading, compaction, as we just talked about, but building up the ground level around these trees. Any excavation, exposing the roots to air and damaging them, so severing roots. And yeah, so putting in things like services, etc., trenching around trees is not a good idea. Changes to soil compaction and drainage, changes to soil composition. So I just talked about things like nutrient enrichment and drainage as well. So if the water content of the soil changes, then this can have an adverse effect on the tree, as well as a change in pH can have an adverse effect on the tree. So in summary, big trees are really valuable and under threat. There are lots of rare species that live in them. Decay is a natural and essential process. Trees are masters of resilience but don't cope well with sudden changes. And you can help protect our most valuable trees by raising awareness of their value, managing them sensitively, and if we do need to manage them, seeking sound advice. So useful links, there's the Ancient Tree Forum website here, and there's a wealth of resources on this website. So you'll find lots of videos, fact sheets, guidance, as well as information on courses and events. There are national and regional field visits where you can meet some of the wonderful old trees and the site managers who look after them. If you're lucky enough, like I was, to look after some of these trees, then I really recommend this book. As I mentioned briefly, there's now a new certificate for arboricultural practitioners and consultants working on these trees. And if you'd like to go to some sites around Bristol that have big populations of these trees, then Ashton Court and Lee Woods are great ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tor. That was absolutely fascinating and practically very helpful, and just a real reminder of the value of these trees in our landscape on so many levels. If anyone's got any questions, please do shout out. Just to say that Alex asked right at the start whether the slides might be shared with us. Just to say that the recording will be shared on our website. So we put up recordings of pretty much all of our online talks on our website, and there will there's a section there where you can catch some of our previous talks as well, including one from Julian Height on Britain's ancient forest, which happened earlier this year. So you can watch it back and have a look at the slides and capture the information that way. And Nicola commented, I think this in regards to the aerial routes that you does this also in Romania. That was something that Nicola has observed. So Paul says, great talk, thanks. Any particular paper or papers that demonstrates the 1,000+ species in a tree? Where can we get your diagram for nature? So just looking at the specific evidence around the 1,000+ species and looking for the diagram as well.
So Dr. Keith Alexander has written a lot of these papers, and the figures that I put forward were from one of his papers. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but if you put Keith Alexander into Google, then you'll come across many of his papers. I think there's also links on the ATF website as well.
Great. So check out the Ancient Tree Forum website as advised. Lovely. Ivona says, are there any local examples of veteran silver birch trees?
Yes, there are. It's one of my favourite trees. So there's an ancient silver birch at Tinsfield, which is in the middle of the parkland. And from a distance, it kind of looks like the smallest, unremarkable tree in the parkland. But when you get up to it, it must be, I think, about between 100 and 150 years old. It's completely hollow, and it looks like it's kind of standing up on stilts. So I'd recommend going to Tinsfield to see that one. It's in a field called Rockfield. So if you ask at visitor reception when you go where that is, hopefully they'll point you into the right direction.
Oh, that's lovely. That's really great. Holly says, are the veteran trees in Lee Woods and Ashton Court available on a map? Well, I actually want to flag something around that. I'm sure you were going to say the same thing, Tor. So, um, Bristol Tree Forum are mapping ancient trees across Bristol, and I believe they have a map specifically of the trees at Ashton Court too. And I'm going to be sending out a link in the email that follows on from this event with a link to the Ashton Court, the Bristol Tree Forum tree mapping, partly for people to be able to look at that, and partly because they're asking for people to contribute to the mapping of all the local ancient and veteran trees. And there will also be a link in the email to the Woodland Trust's Ancient Tree Inventory, which maps the ancient trees nationally. And again, that is something that is interactive and people can contribute to and really help either update records or add new records. Tor, do you have things you'd like to add around that question of kind of seeing a map of UK veteran trees and Lee Woods and Ashton Court veteran?
So the Lee Woods veteran trees are all on the Ancient Tree Inventory, the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory, and you can get that on your phone. So if you're in Lee Woods, just pull that up and you'll be able to see where the trees are near you.
Perfect. Claire says, thank you. That was brilliant. I agree. You mentioned a gap between ancient trees and their successors. Is there anything we can do to change this?
There is a practice called veteranization, and veteranization is something obviously we don't do on veteran trees, but if there is a site, which there are many, where there's old trees and young trees, but there's nothing in between and there's nothing providing that deadwood habitat at the moment. So we can veteranize early mature trees. We'd kind of pick trees where we have a lot of that species at that age and then choose to veteranize some of those. It is a practice that needs to be carried out with a lot of care and consideration, but there is a video on it on the Ancient Tree Forum's website again. And that includes things like ripping branches and damaging bases of trees and all the kinds of things that we're sort of told not to do. But it's about creating this deadwood habitat.
That's fascinating. Wow. So, Becky says, do you know if anyone has looked into whether we could artificially replicate the habitat provided by an ancient tree?
So that's veteranization, and Vicky Bengertson and Helen Reed and Reg Harris have done a lot of work on this. So if you look up their names in veteranization, then you're bound to come across a lot of papers on it.
Fabulous. Gabby says, thanks for a great talk and all your care for these beautiful beings. What legal and or cultural protections, if any, are AVTs afforded?
So yeah, the protection is not brilliant for these trees, but it is getting better. So the fact that they're now considered to be under BNG, they're irreplaceable habitats. So biodiversity net gain now considers them to be irreplaceable habitats. So people will not be given planning permission if it's going to adversely impact any of these trees. And there's also this root protection area in the National Planning Policy Framework, but it needs to, we need more protection for them really. And the Woodland Trust currently has this campaign, which I think is still open, and you can sign your name in support of that.
Specifically, Kate asks, would car parking on a grass verge near mature trees constitute a threat to the tree's health?
Yeah, if it's repeated, then repeated like parking on the root plate of any tree, not just ancient trees, will compaction is one of the quickest killers actually of trees. And you can see if that's happening because there won't be grass growing anymore. So where you compact the soil, then also the grass can't live. So if you've got bare soil under trees, which is continue parked on, then the soil's compacted.
And Paul has a response to Holly about the Lee Woods veteran tree trail. Well, Paul says that the Lee Woods has a veteran tree trail on their website, which is very true, and says, would you like to modernise that tour?
Modernize it? What do you mean by modern?
I'm guessing possibly. Yeah, I don't know what that means. Update it? I don't know. I imagine the veteran trees are exactly where they um,
Yeah. I mean, it is quite
always
old,
were.
that trail. I wrote that years ago, maybe
Ah, I
2015.
see.
So, yeah, it probably could do with updating.
And Rosie says, does Tor know of any tree tours or talks at Ashton Court or Leewoods or around Bristol? So are there kind of active, interactive sessions where you can go along for tours and talks? Do you know of any?
Um, I don't know of any at the moment. Sometimes there's tree walks in Gravel Smythe Park because there's some quite unusual trees, and that comes up. I think that's Tony Titchin that does that, and I think that's once a year. I don't know of any at the moment, but they do crop up. And one of the regional tree forum groups is the Wessex Ancient Tree Forum, which I'm part of, and so is Julian Height. And we've been organising about 3 trips a year, but they're not necessarily in Bristol. They can be anywhere in Wessex.
That's great to know, though. That'd be lovely to get involved with that. So Duncan says, great talk, thanks so much. Is there data available somewhere for ancient or vet status ages for all UK native species?
Ooh, I don't know.
There's a
That's a
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Probably the closest is the ancient tree inventory, I would have thought.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That is a good question. Yeah, that's a piece of work for somebody. Um, Jeremiah says, such a huge subject. Thank you for a brilliant introduction to it. Um, when did the recording of ancient trees begin in the UK?
Um, I think the ancient tree inventory started in 2010, but I'm not sure about before that.
Hmm. Okay, so relatively very recent and
Mm,
more to do.
yeah,
So, well, Paul, you're on the case with the updates. This is fantastic. So, Paul says John from Bristol Parks did a great tour around some of the veteran trees in Ashton Court during the Festival of Nature. So, the Festival of
great.
Nature is something to look out for. And Tanya is just pointing out that there's some very old oaks in Savernake Woods.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
great. So that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, Savanac is brilliant.
okay, that's a good tip if you want to go and meet some of them in person, so to speak. Tom says, given the UK's very high levels of deforestation, how has the UK supposedly ended up with such high levels of ancient veteran trees compared to Europe or even the world?
I think yeah, that's something I keep meaning to look more into, but I think it has to do with the Enclosures Act. But then also, a lot of these trees are now found on our old estates, which are now protected. So they'll be in designed landscapes which are listed. Um, yeah, a lot of them are in churchyards as well. A lot of them are also owned by the Crown. So in places like Windsor Great Park.
Question. Nicola wonders what you think about piles of dead wood in gardens in terms of, I think that's
Great. Piles of dead wood anywhere. Brilliant.
that's a thumbs up for piles of dead wood.
Yeah,
Great. Um, Cam says, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, Tor. I just have a clarifying question regarding the quote about the UK potentially having the most AVT in Europe. Um, if you know, wondered if that was in direct numbers or relative to land, say land area. Brilliant fact, which really shocked me. Thanks again.
yeah. I think there is more about that again on the Ancient Tree Forum website. And when I go on talks with the Ancient Tree Forum, they always say that we have more veteran trees than anywhere in the world. But I've not seen a paper that proves that. But I'm not saying it's wrong. So, but we're supposed to have more ancient veteran trees than all of Europe.
Let's keep it that way. So RE soil compaction, Alex says, does that mean grazing in pasture with trees is a bad idea?
It depends on stocking numbers. So no, actually it isn't, because low stocking levels is good, particularly with older breeds, because that helps to keep down the competing vegetation. So we looked at that tree in Lee Woods that was in the wood pasture, which is now secondary woodland, and it was the grazing that kept that woodland down and stopped that tree from having competition from the younger trees. But stocking levels is important. So if you have high numbers of stock, then that will have an effect compaction wise. And also, the type of stock. And sheep in high numbers are not great around these old trees because they also like to nibble their bark as well as compact the roots.
So as always, it's complex, but it's not a straight no. So um, Karen Foster asks, would there be any different laws in Scotland for veteran trees? This is specifically in relation to the public fighting to prevent the passing of legislation allowing the selling of land at Drumkinnon Woods in Balloch to a large holiday company who want to put a theme or leisure park in the area. So yeah, just asking, are there different laws in Scotland for veteran trees?
I think so, but I don't really know what they are.
Okay. Uh, a big thumbs up for the brilliant job on the current Lee Woods tree trail. Wouldn't mind making it a little more family friendly, and a couple of smiley faces on that. So that's just a bit of feedback on the tree trail. Um, uh, and doing a little bit more on bats for that tree trail as well.
Lee
And
Woods did used to run bat walks. I mean, I'm not part of that team anymore, but we did used to do 2 or 3 bat walks a year. So it could be worth getting in touch with the Lee Woods team to see what walks they now have.
um, Thank you. And Becky says, are some species of trees more precious than others when it comes to AVTs? Using any measure you like.
Um, I think they're all important. I think all of the species of older trees are important. I love oak trees, but I think they're all important.
And Debs asks, Tor, can you briefly tell us a bit about how you got into this work and what your career progression was like? I think that is a
Um,
question for anyone attending from the Avon Trees Green Skills course who are really interested in getting into the green sector and looking at career progression
I
pathway.
actually started as a volunteer. So I started as a volunteer with the district council, carrying out land management, and then was working with one of the tree officers and started to shadow him doing tree surveys, tree safety surveys, and just got really interested in it. And yeah, it went from there really. Got the job with the National Trust at Lee Woods, and then I got into veteran trees and management of veteran trees. I did do a course in the evenings. I did an arboricultural level 2 course, and then that just helped me along with getting my current job. But yeah, I'm always going on courses, and it's a lifetime of learning, really. You never stop learning about these trees.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I think that's all our questions, unless anyone else has anything else. That was a fantastic selection of questions and really interesting to hear about. And I love having the Q&A at the end. It really just brings so much out. And Debs says, you're a pioneer as a woman in forestry tour. Loads of great questions from the Woodland Skills participants tonight. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, thanks for all those contributions. That is absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box, but I'll just wrap up by saying thank you so much, Tor, just echoing what everyone else has said. Yeah, and there's lots of positives coming in now. Great talk, brilliant talk. Thank you. Thanks for answering so many questions and that kind of thing, rich and informative talk. So lots of positive feedback, and I really concur with that. as I said, there'll be an email coming out this evening. It does have a feedback form on the email, so please do complete that. It really, really helps us, especially if you're new to these talks. Please do let us know how it went for you. Also in the talk will be the mapping links I talked about for the Bristol Tree Forum for local ancient and veteran trees, and the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory, so you can find out where they are, go and visit them, and also contribute to that mapping process if you're able to do that. And then there will be links to get involved with Avon Needs Trees. If you'd like to get involved with our volunteering programme in any way, and particularly with our tree planting season, supporting our crowdfunder and just finding out more about everything that we're doing, that will all be in the email too. And yeah, I will also, which I should have done already, but I will pop in the link to the Ancient Tree Forum so that you can then follow up with all the resources that Tor has talked about. And if you want to revisit the talk or share it with other people, do check out the videos of previous events on the AMP website. And I think there'll be lots of other interesting stuff in there too, if people would like to look at that. Yeah, just I'll finish with a little bit of the feedback. Could listen to you talk for hours. Thank you, Tor. And Anna says, tremendously interesting. Thanks so much. Well done, Anna. Perfect. Thank you, Tor. Super interesting talk. Feeling inspired to learn more about these wonderful trees. So there we go. Job done. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeremiah. That's lovely. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon online or out there in the woodlands. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care of yourselves and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye now.